Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream, and today we're going to be talking about 12 incredibly underrated movies you can currently catch on Prime Video. So, not only is this a list of 12 really fantastic, and I mean some of the best movies currently included with Prime Video, there are also 12 underrated movies that you probably have not seen, so there should be some bangers on this list for you to add to your watch list soon. This video is sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens, and I'll be telling you more about their stuff later in the video, but we're going to start this list of 12 movies off with one starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt that was actually produced by Natalie Portman and flew in way under the radar when it was released. HESHER.
Hello there, young man.
Hey, old lady. TJ, who is this? My name's HESHER. I'm a friend of your son's.
Metallica fans, this is your movie. Definitely check it out. Do not miss it. Metallica is actually a band famous for not lending their music to movies unless they really like the movie. This is one of the smallest movies they've ever allowed their music to be in. Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays this guy, and he kind of reluctantly takes a young boy under his wing in this movie. There's a lot of coming-of-age stuff, but this movie actually gets much more chaotic than you would expect. However, at the core, the story is a coming-of-age one. If you're the least bit interested in this character that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is playing, then definitely check out this movie. It's really well done. However, if you're not particularly interested in it, I don't know that there's a lot else there for you. So there were some wild behavior experiments that took place in the 1960s that really pushed the limits ethically, but they also did an amazing job of testing how far ordinary people would go to obey authority. And there's a movie about these experiments called Experimenter.
In nearly every case, the essential results are the same. They hesitate, sigh, tremble, and groan, but they advance to the last switch, 450 volts, because they're politely told to.
Now, the setup for these experiments is that they would take these test subjects into a room with a little electrical box, and they would be asked to electrocute someone in the other room, which was not actually happening, but they believe they're electrocuting someone every time they're told to. And they're also told that the shocks increase, they can hear screaming coming from the next room, and the test was to see how ordinary people might just follow some authority figure in a lab coat. It is a wild concept. These were considered fairly unethical at the time, and the movie does a great job of capturing all of that. Ultimately, Experimenter never really got off the ground for me, but it did go in some interesting directions, and the experiment itself is well worth watching in this sort of glossy produced movie. Okay, now even though I'm Darren Van Dam, it's very rare on this channel that you see me reviewing a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie, mainly because they're either fantastic and everyone knows about them, or they're not really worth talking about. However, he's got a hidden gem movie that I think is highly underrated, incredibly well produced, and one of the more interesting projects he's ever worked on. It's titled JCVD.
Cut.
The window didn't explode, right? I'm 47 years old, and it's very difficult for me to do everything in one shot.
Obviously, those are his initials, and he plays himself in this movie, which is part of what makes it so interesting. What makes it even more interesting is he actually gets caught up in a bank heist. And no, it's not a heist movie. He's just trapped in a bank with other victims during a fairly realistic bank heist that becomes a hostage situation. So the setup is kind of like your typical Jean-Claude Van Damme movie, except he's playing himself, and he's really struggling with whether or not he should take action or wait for the police. So it's this interesting concept to start, and then they thoroughly explore it in this movie. For a Jean-Claude Van Damme flick, it is fairly slow-paced, but the way it was directed is incredibly interesting, and they even open up the movie with this long action sequence that's done in one take, just to sort of kick things off right, and it's, again, really well done. This is an incredibly well-directed movie, and it's one of the best performances that he's ever given. Obviously, it's a little easy him playing himself, but he really does do a killer job in this flick. My next pick is one of the more grim movies on this list, and it comes all the way from Australia, and is only a few years old. It's titled Sweet Country. This is an Australian Western that takes place in the 1920s, and the thing I love about Australian movies, particularly historical dramas, is you get to see all the similarities between Australia's history and US history. Their frontier era was very much like ours, even if it took place a little bit after ours. But in this movie, an Aboriginal man shoots a white man in self-defense and then has to go on the run. So obviously it deals with a lot of racial issues that are somewhat unique to Australia, but also not necessarily that unique to Australia. But it's also basically just a solid Western movie that's, again, only like 5 years old. We don't get that many Westerns now, and this happens to be an exceptional one. Personally, for my money, I think The Proposition is probably the best Australian Western ever made, but this one's in a similar class. My next pick on this list is the first feature film from director Sofia Coppola. Her subsequent film would be Lost in Translation, which would launch her career, Scarlett Johansson's, and reignited Bill Murray's, but before that, she directed The Virgin Suicides.
Tom Fahim suggested we fly a kite with a message alongside the house, but that had logistical problems. In the end, the answer was so simple it took a week to come up with. We called them on the telephone.
Released in 1999, this movie takes place in suburban Detroit in the 1970s, and the story is actually told from the perspective of a group of boys who become very interested in this group of young girls that are very sheltered by their religious family. You've got some heavy hitters in this one too. Josh Hartnett, Kristen Dunst, James Woods plays the father, and Kathleen Turner plays the mother. And while this is ultimately a sad movie, I mean, they do give you a major turning point in the title. It's also this really interesting look at life for high school students in the 1970s. It's got a very different flavor than most 70s era movies. And while I'm personally not a big fan of Sofia Coppola's work as a director, I would rank this one just under Lost in Translation as maybe her second best film of all time. But on that note, something that has become part of my routine over the last year is today's sponsor, AG1 by Athletic Greens. So in the last couple of years, I have gone through a lot of changes. I've become a full-time YouTuber, and with the free time that's given me, I've gotten into some of the best shape of my life by far. And I attribute that to a lot of things. I'm eating right, I'm exercising regularly, and I'm drinking a glass of AG1 every day. AG1 is an easy and convenient powder that you mix into a small 8-ounce glass of water, yet it is completely packed with vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and adaptogens. And I'm having to do quite a bit of work to add muscle to a body that's almost 40 years old, so I eat a ton of protein to do that. I mean, I literally do not have room in my system for anywhere close to all the leafy greens I would need to eat to get the benefits from just one small glass of AG1. And right now, when my viewers use the link in the description below, they'll get a free gift, including a full year's worth of vitamin D3 and K2, which is going to further support your immune system. And I don't know why you wouldn't have the strongest immune system possible right now. You're also going to get 5 travel packs of AG1 just as a bonus. But you also get all of this stuff, the nice big bag of Athletic Greens, this really nice metal jar to store it in the fridge, bottle, a nice little metal scoop. It's a lot of stuff on your first order. So again, go to the link in the description below. You'll get that free gift of vitamin D3 and K2 and the travel packs. It's a wonderful thing to add to your routine, but speaking of wonderful things, let's talk about the rest of the movies on this list. For any conspiracy theorist watching, my next pick is going to be the one for you off of this list. It also happens to star Dustin Hoffman, who is not in that many quote-unquote hidden gem movies, but I consider Marathon Man to be highly underrated.
A live, freshly cut nerve is infinitely more sensitive.
So, I'll just drill into a healthy tooth until I reach the pulp. Unless, of course, you can tell me that it's safe.
In this movie, Hoffman plays a history student living in New York City when he begins to be hunted down by these shadowy government agents, and he really does not understand why. He gets thrown headfirst into this major conspiracy, and it ends up being this incredibly thrilling movie with a lot of mystery in it. So, if you're someone who likes digging into conspiracy theories at all, this one's not about necessarily a real one or a big one, yet it's really intense. It's got espionage elements, yet because Dustin Hoffman's character doesn't really know what's going on, it's gonna tickle all those little conspiracy theory nerves that you've got. My next pick is the only black and white movie on this list, yet it's only a handful of years old, and it did get quite a bit of recognition back when it came out. It was nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards, yet I doubt it's been a while since anyone cared or watched Nebraska.
Keith White. He wanted in my pants too, but he was so boring. See what you could have had, Keith, if you hadn't talked about weed all the time?
This is from director Alexander Payne, who's most famous for his movies Election and Sideways. While Nebraska's not as popular as those movies, I think it's every bit as good. Will Forte, of all people, plays a man who's taking his aging father on kind of one last trip. If you've ever taken care of an aging parent or grandparent, this is a wonderful movie that takes a long, hard look at that experience. Bruce Dern plays the father in what might be his last great role. No, he didn't die. He is still in things. In fact, he's got quite a few things currently filming. He's a busy man, but this movie really required a lot of him, and he's on screen quite a bit, meaning this might be the last major, big, fantastic role from a legendary actor like Bruce Dern. June Squibb is amazing in this movie. The score is really kind of touching and fantastic. And the story ultimately is really top-notch stuff. I mean, that is kind of the reason it's in black and white, and the reason it's cast the way it is they really want to highlight the story that unfolds here. As simple and as familiar as it may be, Alexander Payne does an amazing job of directing this type of story, and quality-wise, Nebraska is every bit as good as Sideways. My next choice on this list comes from director Justin Lin. If that name is not familiar, he directed several Fast and the Furious movies, technically some of the best ones of the series. He also did Star Trek Beyond, which wasn't terrible, but his very first movie I think is still far and away his best. It's titled Better Luck Tomorrow.
We were putting the laws of supply and demand into practice, and then it snowballed.
You think you can break in? It's gonna be a lot of money involved.
Our straight A's were our alibis. As long as our grades were there, we were trusted.
This is about a group of teenage boys who are all overachievers and then begin to dip their toe into crime. They begin dabbling with drugs, a little bit of theft, and things continue to escalate. So this one's kind of half crime movie, half coming of age story. And when this movie released, there was actually a little bit of controversy. Some people felt like it painted Asian Americans in a negative light, whereas other people, people like Roger Ebert, felt like this was just fantastic roles for Asian Americans to finally be getting. I happen to agree with Roger Ebert on this front. As actors, these are all really interesting, fleshed out characters to get to play. Plus, their behavior in this movie is clearly the exception to all humans. I mean, they're really stepping out of the bounds of social norms, to say the least, but all of that stuff is incredibly interesting, and this ends up being way more intense than you would expect just based on the first half of the story. I mean, things get really out of hand the deeper you go with this one. Another underrated movie about some people doing drugs and crimes is one of the grungiest, dirtiest, filthiest drug movies ever made, Spun.
Russ, where's Nicky?
Now, as dirty as this movie is, it's got a huge cast, including Mickey Rourke, John Leguizamo, Brittany Murphy, Jason Schwartzman, and Mina Savari. This movie has a lot in common with Trainspotting, yet it's dirtier, it's filthier, it is not the kind of place you want to be, yet all of those actors are playing these incredible characters in this otherwise scummy underbelly of a world in this movie. Now, this movie does push the limit, it does go into some pretty intense territories. Do not watch this one if you've got a weak stomach. However, the version currently on Prime Video is an edited version. If you want to see the original version of this movie, you may need to rent it or maybe even purchase a hard copy. All right, so Sofia Coppola was mentioned on this list. She's obviously the daughter of one of the most famous directors of all time, Francis Ford Coppola, but one of his most underrated movies was actually released between The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2. It stars Gene Hackman and is titled The Conversation. Now, this is the closest I think Francis Ford Coppola ever came to creating a Hitchcock movie. This is obviously done with his own style, but the setup here is very much like a classic Hitchcock thriller. Gene Hackman plays a surveillance expert, and kind of what's cool about that is you get to see real minute details on surveillance. A lot of this stuff is obviously outdated today, but to see what surveillance looked like in the mid-70s is kind of cool by itself before you even get into the story. And then this surveillance expert, who's always listening to other people's conversations, begins to become very paranoid when he believes something awful is about to happen to one of the people he's surveying. This is incredibly well directed by Coppola, again making it one of his most underrated movies, and Gene Hackman does an amazing job here too as he begins to kind of unravel. He's a really organized, tight-laced character at the beginning. Through paranoia, he begins to really kind of lose his mind. This has got some incredible sequences in it. If you've liked anything that I've described here, make this one of the first ones you watch off of this list. Okay, my number 2 pick on this list is one I've talked about before. It's one of my favorite hidden gems to recommend on Prime Video right now. That's why it comes in at number 2, but my number 1 pick is one of the newest movies added to Prime Video, and it's also one of the best, seriously, one of the best straight-to-streaming movies I've ever seen. And that's a bold statement because I see all of them. But it stars Jennifer Tilly and Gina Gershon as a couple of lesbian lovers trying to knock off their mob boyfriend in Bound. Now the story with this one is the Wachowskis were selling The Matrix to Warner Brothers and they wanted to direct it, but Warner Brothers said, hey, you guys have never directed a movie before. Here's $1 million, go make something cool. If we like it, we'll let you direct The Matrix. They made Bound. Warner Brothers liked it, obviously, and bought The Matrix, allowing them to direct it. What's so cool about that is you can see the beginning of their style. There are several shots in Bound that look like they're straight out of The Matrix. There's also a pretty hot lesbian sex scene in this movie, and then ultimately it turns into this amazing caper where they're trying to steal all of this money. While this mob meeting is going on, there's some fantastic character actors in this, and really great scenes of tension considering the story is mostly relegated to 2 apartments on the same floor. This came out all the way back in 1996 and still holds up as a solid thriller today. It doesn't even look aged that much except for the fact that Jennifer Tilly and Gina Gershon are in their prime in this movie, but it really is an excellent thriller that far too few people still know about. If you've never seen it, make it one of the first ones you watch off of this list. Now, some of you may have already seen my next pick, but most of you haven't because it just recently hit Prime Video. Completely took my breath away. I was not expecting this movie. It stars Colin Farrell and Viggo Mortensen as the English divers who saved all of those boys in that Thailand cave just a few years ago.
Johnny, okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. Just give me a minute, please. Okay. We can make it.
Not only is this just an incredibly harrowing story, I mean, I remember the news story back when it came out. I had no idea the lengths they had to go through to get these boys out. Not only is that the case, but you get amazing performances from Colin Farrell, Viggo Mortensen, and a handful of other actors are all great in this movie. I was often reminded of Apollo 13, just the way it was shot, the claustrophobia, how intense it was from moment to moment. And then the credits rolled and it's directed by Ron Howard as well. So this is an incredibly well-directed movie. I mean, there were several sequences in this movie that were almost too intense for me. They felt so real. I mean, honestly, at times this felt almost like a documentary. They did such an amazing job of reenacting the entire scenario that it kind of just feels like the cameras are there. It doesn't feel like they're piecing together shots and constructing a movie. It looks as if they're actually having to go get people out of this cave, and it's just an incredible experience. I mean, really, it's one of the best movies I've seen that have gone straight to a streaming service, maybe ever. That includes Netflix originals, Prime originals. This is a solid flick that I honestly don't know why it went straight to Prime. I feel like this could have done well in theaters. I feel like this should be nominated for awards when award season rolls around. Whether it is or not, It's an incredible movie that definitely deserves your attention. Check it out, but watch it with the right mindset. Again, this is an incredibly intense movie, especially if you lock into it and give it your attention. But that is the list. Thanks to AG1 again for sponsoring another video. I really do make it part of my routine and will likely continue whether they sponsor this channel or not. So go check out that link in the description below, or go to DarrenVanDam.com for additional movie recommendations. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Prime Video episode, and you will see me on the next one.